G'day from Sydney, Australia. My name is Max Burns-McRuvie. I'm a historian and tour guide, owner of tour company Journey Walks in the city, and my work, as well as my passion, is all about bringing Sydney's incredible history to life. This recording is a special presentation and a Christmas present for Tony. Merry Christmas from Sydney, Tony. I had the pleasure of guiding your daughter and her partner through Sydney's history earlier this year, and she's commissioned this special presentation on a topic I hear you might be interested in. Our topic today is a history of Sydney Harbour's defences. Through this lens, I'll explore Sydney's earliest beginnings and why, from the earliest stages of Sydney's humble colonial development, which began in the late 18th century on the shoreline of a unique little inlet of water in our harbour, known as Sydney Cove, somewhere that for many thousands of years had also been an important spot in the amazing water world of Sydney's ancient Indigenous peoples, why Sydney felt it had to put so much effort into the fortifications and defence strategies that would help protect it from the ever-looming threat of a foreign attack. We'll trace this story all the way back to the Napoleonic era, at a time when colonial Sydney was first establishing itself as a remote and isolated outpost of the British Empire, which had been chosen by the British as the site for a unique experiment which revolved around banishing unwanted thieves who had been charged with petty crimes in the UK to the other side of the world to forge their own prison settlement, and by using their forced labour to spawn an agriculturally based economy that would serve as the basis for a new maritime port and town run on military lines with governors chosen from the Navy and later the Army, chosen in part so that the British Empire could extend its long and powerful control over the far side of the world and utilise the enormous landmass of Australia as a launch pad for British shipping and trade into the South Pacific and beyond, before the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese and the Spanish could make their own political land grab on this ancient continent and in effect allowed the British to colonise much of Australasia over the 19th century. But this of course was only the beginning, and the bustling city of Sydney today, home to approximately 5 million people, will be a unique success story in terms of its rapid growth as an important, wealthy and very livable place, which many thousands outside of our forced convict transportation era will choose to immigrate to over its history. But of course, as we'll discuss, the more that Sydney evolved from a settlement to a village to a town to a city, the more that it realised it needed to defend itself, and this will lead us all the way from the late 18th century to the one and only time that it was finally attacked, an infamous event in Sydney's history that took place during the drama of the Second World War and involved a covert operation by 3 midget submarines belonging to the Imperial Japanese forces that attempted to penetrate into the heart of Sydney's waterway in a targeted attack against Sydney's Naval Command Centre. And whilst this was an unprecedented moment in the story of our city that caused death, destruction and much drama, before I go on to illustrate this 1942 submarine attack in some detail, I'm going to construct a timeline that builds up towards World War II, that follows the evolution of Sydney's defence strategies, from hand-cut stone fortresses built by convicts to the secret laying of underwater explosives and the eventual establishment of the Australian Navy with its battleship building docks and command centre located then, as it still is now, at a large naval facility within the harbour known as Garden Island. And alongside this audio recording, I've created a presentation of imagery that will help to visually reimagine Sydney's long saga of defence preparations and, in the end, when push came to shove, how effective they were in protecting this city from the attack that finally came. So Tony, now I've completed my introduction, sit back, relax, and let's begin by rewinding the clock. First and foremost, let's begin by talking a little bit about Sydney's unique location, because it's really the geography of Sydney's harbour that will determine so much of its history. As far as we know, the grand body of water we refer to as Sydney Harbour, which actually is named Port Jackson, has only existed in its present state for the last 8 to 10,000 years, maybe even less. Prior to that time, in the area where the harbour now sits, there was once a deep freshwater valley. And running through this valley system from the lands to the west out to the east coast of the Pacific Ocean was an ancient river. And amazingly, the course of this river is still etched into the bedrock of the harbour's basin today. This was at a time when the sea levels of the Pacific Ocean were much lower than they are today, And the coastline of the east coast of Australia had a few extra miles of land which extended out into the Pacific Ocean but are now submerged underwater. But at the end of the last ice age, as the polar cap started to melt, the sea levels of the Pacific rose, which flooded the low-lying lands along the east coast of Australia, and slowly but surely started to fill up Sydney's ancient river basin system, so that where there was once a valley, there now is a saltwater harbour. The harbour that formed became an elaborate series of coves, waterways, and at least a dozen islands, some which were little more than a pile of rocks above the surface of the water, and others sizable enough that they would go on to support shipbuilding industries, prisons, storage bunkers for ammunition, and even small fortresses to help protect Sydney. It's incredible to note that the ancient indigenous peoples of the Sydney region pre-exist the formation of our harbour by tens of thousands of years, as this deep body of salt water gradually flooded the river system they'd previously fished in. They grew to adapt and thrive within this ecosystem. As thousands more years passed by, the harbourside clans of Sydney's Aboriginal population would utilise this seafood supermarket that arrived on their doorstep. Many of the fishing techniques of these ancient peoples were recorded in illustrations and engravings and written accounts by the earliest colonists. In particular, the use of bark canoes from a single piece of bark ripped off a certain tree, which was made seaworthy by twining, resining and charring, could accommodate 1 to 2 adults and their children on daily fishing expeditions throughout the waterways using spears, lines, hooks and nets. But of course, one day, into this timeless water world, the colonists would arrive. The first European that we know of to map the east coast of Australia was the famous explorer Captain Cook. Under secret orders from the British Admiralty, he had charted the east coast of Australia in 1770 and moored his ship, the Endeavour, for about a week in April, a little bit further south from Sydney Harbour, in a body of water he initially called Stingray Harbour, because that's what he caught there, a fellow explorer and botanist on this mission, that due to the unique vegetation and new species to science that were found in the undergrowth surrounding this harbour, Botany Bay would be a more appropriate title. Continuing to sail north along the east coastline of Australia, Captain Cook soon spotted the mighty gates of the north and south head belonging to Sydney Harbour, but as far as we know, never ventured in to explore the waterways inside. It would be 18 years before colonists returned to this coastline. This incredible voyage from the UK in 1788 is known as the Journey of the First Fleet. It involved 11 ships which had carried about 1,500 people, 15,000 miles, all the way from Portsmouth in the UK to Botany Bay, here down under. Roughly 800 of these first fleeters were prisoners of the Crown, and of these transported convicts there were approximately 600 men and 200 women. The youngest a 13-year-old boy, a former chimney sweep and orphan who had been charged with stealing clothing, and the oldest reportedly an 82-year-old lady charged with perjury. By today's standards, the crimes of these convicts were very small indeed, almost all of them having been convicted in the 1780s for stealing property or food in one form or another, and their unusual punishment, to be banished from their homes in the UK, transported halfway round the world, under guard by about 350 Marines of the British Navy, and for the next 7, 14 years or life, depending on their sentence, to be exploited for their labour in the establishment of their own penal colony. The journey of the First Fleet is an arduous and dramatic story on its own, but after about 8 months at sea and 3 stops, that is the Canary Islands, Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town, where extra supplies, tools, livestock and thousands of gallons of rum were collected and loaded onto the ships, all 11 transports of the First Fleet managed to arrive in Botany Bay within 1.5 days of each other, around the 20th of January 1788. About 50 of the convicts had perished along the way, but their Commander-in-Chief, Captain Arthur Phillip, the first Governor of New South Wales, had done his best to try and maintain their survival rate, especially when stacked against slave shipping across the Atlantic during the same period. The trouble was, whilst the 11 ships of the First Fleet had reached their destination, the conditions they now found in Botany Bay left much to be desired. It seems that when Captain Cook had visited this spot 18 years earlier, water was flowing into the bay from several sources after heavy rain. The vegetation looked greener and more lush, and it seemed an appropriate spot to try and start farms. But seasons had now changed, and Captain Arthur Phillip found himself in a bay that was far too shallow to dock his ships nearby the shoreline, too dry and sandy to attempt harvesting crops, and most importantly, lacking the key resource that the colony needed to survive: fresh water. Desperate to try and find a more suitable spot, Arthur Phillip ordered that the convicts remain on their prison ships, while he and his officers sailed on a small cutter out of Botany Bay and further north up the coast. Upon entering through the north and south headlands of what would become Sydney Harbour, the fortunes of these very first colonists appeared to have changed considerably. Quote, "Here, all regret arising from the former disappointments was at once obliterated, and I had the satisfaction to find one of the finest harbours in the world in which 1,000 sail of the line might ride in perfect security." Arthur Phillip, 1788. Of all the coves in Sydney Harbour, the one that Phillip and his officers deemed to be the most suitable for their small colony was about halfway up the waterway on the southern side of the shoreline. This cove possessed a small but vital ingredient, that of a fresh spring of water which delivered a small stream flowing directly into the harbour, dividing the two sides of the cove and allowing for their most basic resource of survival to be met even in times of drought. On the eastern side of this stream was a rising hill thickly forested with figs, eucalypts and ferns. It dipped into a parallel valley, also with its own water source, and seeming to possess a rich and fertile soil. Land at this location would be cleared by convicts within the first few weeks, and a small farm and vegetable garden would be established here to try and feed the colony from the seeds and grains they brought along with them. Farm Cove, as this spot is still known today, would continue to grow vegetation of all sorts, so much so that 25 years later it will be re-landscaped into Sydney's Royal Botanical Gardens. On the western side of the freshwater stream was a rocky headland of sandstone. It was here that the colony's first convicts would make their camp, a place still known as the Rocks. And the depth of the harbour beside the shoreline of the Rocks was found to be yet another key advantage to the establishment of a portside town. The First Fleet ships with convicts, cargo and even cattle would have no issues docking here, with depths of up to 90 feet alongside the foreshore of the Rocks. It ensured that shipping of all sizes could conveniently anchor and unload goods and peoples directly into the settlement of Sydney. So, after relocating the 11 convict ships of the First Fleet to this valuable inlet of water, raising a flag on the 26th of January, saluting King George III and the health of the colony to come, the convicts, cargo, livestock, supplies, and rum was finally rolled ashore. Sydney Cove, named after Lord Sydney, a politician back in London who would never actually visit this far-flung colony, would forge itself on the forced labour of transported convicts, deeply disrupting the ancient ways of life of Sydney's indigenous population, and struggle to survive through the early years of starvation, skirmishes, disease, as well as a serious lack of skills and supplies. But survive it did, and by 1791, the harbourside settlement of Sydney Cove was growing in size and strength. A special regiment of the British forces, known as the New South Wales Corps, had arrived to oversee the convict penal system, which by this point had received more and more prison ships, thus supplying a growing labour force to farm the lands, cut the stone, and build the structures necessary for a fledgling society. And it was also at this time to start thinking about Sydney's defences. After all, by 1791, Great Britain was at war not only with France but with Spain. In fear of an attack by Spanish ships in Sydney Harbour, the first of what would become many defence forts was constructed at Dawes Point. This was an armed battery built of sandstone blocks at the tip of the western headland of Sydney Cove, a spot now hidden below the southern arch of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. To an approaching ship entering Sydney Cove, the Dawes Point battery appeared as a solid fortress in the shape of a small turreted castle. Its outer wall was armed with about a dozen large cannons, with others stationed higher within the structure. However, this early battery was widely criticised for being much more aesthetic than it was functional. What appeared like a fortified castle from the water was little more than a stone wall on closer inspection. It was at least hoped by Sydney's commanders at this stage that any French or Spanish spies arriving in the colony on trading ships would report back that Sydney looked better protected than it really was. But luckily, no attack by ship would come. Even still, as Sydney grew in size and strength, from a settlement to a village and soon a town, it was all too clear that its harbour was weakly protected from a potential enemy invasion. There was also the very real possibility of a convict uprising from within. With this in mind, other lines of defence were quickly erected. This included Fort Phillip, which was a strong-walled hexagonal stone fort built in 1801 on the high ground above the rocks at Sydney Cove, a place known as Flagstaff Hill. The flagstaff referred to this location as a signal station for the raising of naval flags on a high mast to communicate messages with a corresponding signal station that had been erected right at the tip of the South Head, facing the Pacific Ocean, ensuring that any ship that was about to approach Sydney Harbour would be spotted by a lookout and relayed by flag codes to the sentries posted with spyglasses ever watching from Flagstaff Hill at the rocks. This early form of flag communication from the entrance of the harbour to the town of Sydney was finally updated in 1858 with the installation of the first electric telegraph cables. But the very first years of the early 1800s would also see Sydney start to prepare an outer line of defence. Essentially, the outer line defence strategy employed from the early 1800s onwards shifted from a focus that just protected the town of Sydney at Sydney Cove to an installation of defence activity right at the entrance of the harbour. This would utilise the prominent stone headlands such as George's Head and Middle Head, which had a direct line of sight to the very entrance of the harbour. This strategy, which will greatly expand towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, was all about protecting the entrance of the harbour so that if any ships were bold enough to enter the waterway, they'd be attacked by cannons before they ever made it close to the urban centre. The first defence preparations at this point of the harbour, at George's Head, utilised a work gang of 44 male convicts between 1801 and 1803 who would hand-cut the solid stone boulders at the very tip of the headland into a defence battery. At the time, the Governor of New South Wales, Philip Gidley King, would send correspondence to the Secretary for the Colonies back in London that a battery was in forwardness opposite the entrance to the harbour, which will completely prevent attack from without. The anticipated attack was, of course, from the French. With the Napoleonic Wars in full throttle and the Battle of Trafalgar yet to be won by the British, Sydney became increasingly nervous, perhaps even paranoid about a potential invasion. The spot in the harbour chosen for this first outer battery was very difficult to access and extremely isolated from the original settlement of Sydney Cove. The convict work gang spent 2 hard years hacking away at the solid sandstone using only picks, crowbars, wedges and sledgehammers, but in the end a gun pit was created, leaving a curved parapet 80 foot long on the cliff edge, about 50 feet above sea level. There were 2 embrasures or gun openings, but guns could also be fired over the parapet. The guns, 4 12-pounders and 2 6-pounders, were landed at Obelisk Beach, then hauled up through the bush. Also completed at the gun pit was a magazine for powder and shot with stone walls 3 foot thick. As reported in the first Sydney newspaper in 1803, once completed, this fortress had command over the centre of the harbour, the entrance, and towards the inward part of the waterway leading to Sydney. But this was only the early beginnings of what would transform into the primary barracks for defence at George's Heights, which I'll continue to discuss soon. The period of the Napoleonic Wars were a tense time for the British Empire all over the world. The threat of a French naval fleet sailing unexpectedly into the harbour in order to capture this uniquely placed maritime port led towards various strategies and improvements of the defences of Sydney in the early 1800s, especially when new maps of the continent of Australia were reproduced back in Europe with new French names such as Terra Napoleon, based on French navigations of the coastline all the way round the country, until our 5th governor arrived, Major General Lachlan Macquarie, who for the first time in the colony's history was sourced from the Army rather than the Navy and arrived with his loyal regiment, the 73rd Infantry on foot, to begin his influential role for the next 12 years as Commander-in-Chief of New South Wales, based in Sydney in 1810. The legacy of Governor Macquarie is hard to forget in Sydney because almost everything he built or achieved he named after himself. And in terms of his building program for the safety and defences of the harbour, two of his major structural achievements were Macquarie Tower, Australia's first lighthouse positioned at the south head next to the signal station, and Fort Macquarie. This was a sandstone sea fortress built between 1817 and 1821 and was constructed on the site where the Opera House of Sydney now stands, that is the eastern headland of Sydney Cove. This fortress would replace a smaller defensive battery on this headland constructed in the 1790s, and in its original state included a 60-foot high octagonal guard tower, several supporting turrets, all made of sandstone, and even a medieval-style drawbridge which connected the headland to the fortress itself, which had been built on a pile of rocks which was essentially a tidal island. A chamber inside was capable of storing 350 barrels of gunpowder, and a guardhouse which accommodated one officer and another 18 men, and 15 large cannons, including 10 24-pounders and 5 6-pounders, which had a pretty decent range aimed at the middle part of the harbour, so that any attacking ships would now face the Beehive Battery aimed at the entrance, then Fort Macquarie if they approached Sydney Cove, as well as the original Dawes Point Battery, and as a last line of defence, Fort Phillip on the highest point of the rocks. And whilst the daily command of all of these defence posts, especially in the first half of the 19th century, ensured that a steady stream of British regiments were continually stationed in Sydney, guarding forts and ready to act, but no such attack ever came. But even after the Macquarie years, which ended in 1822, Sydney continued its paranoia about an imminent attack from sea. The weaknesses of its defences were certainly highlighted in the year 1839. This was due to the surprise visitation of 2 American warships into Sydney Harbour on the 30th of November that year. Unannounced and under the cover of darkness, the sloop of war Peacock and the sloop of war Vincennes entered the harbour and silently centred themselves in the middle of the waterway without detection from the South Head signal station or any other sentries. Whilst this was a courtesy visit by the American Navy and by no means a threat of attack, it was made very clear to Sydney by the American warships that had these 2 sloops of war intended to take Sydney, they could have within a matter of hours. Military commanders were deeply embarrassed about this moment in Sydney. Only 1 year later, in 1840, the colony would stop receiving convict transports. It had received at least 80,000 since 1788 to New South Wales, and thanks in part to the enormous boost that their free labour had assisted with the construction of a prosperous town, a good agricultural society, and an economy that was now starting to flourish in the world of trade, particularly in the Southeast Pacific with Asia, China, and across to America. It was clear that Sydney needed more defences, and Governor Denison in the 1840s, fearing a potential Russian attack over the Crimean War with the British Empire, would order that a small pile of rocks known as Pinchgut Island, that sat conveniently in the middle of the harbour in a centre point that further protected Sydney Cove, would be reconstructed into a distinctive Martello Tower, the only one of its kind in Australia and the last of its kind built in the British Empire. This unique island fortress with its sandstone tower that Sydney still possesses today was constructed using 8,000 tonnes of local stone with a base wall thickness of 22 feet. On its completion in the 1850s, 24 soldiers and 1 officer were garrisoned here, and its armament included 3 8-inch muzzle loaders in the tower, 2 10-inch guns, 1 on a 360-degree traverse at the top of the tower, and 1 in a bastion at the other end of the island, and 12 32-pound cannons in a battery between the base of the tower and the flanking bastion. But while that all sounded like a lot of firepower, Was this really enough? After all, in 1851, New South Wales had struck gold. And with this gold rush came a booming economy in the city of Sydney. Trade routes flourished, free immigration flooded in, and whilst the British Empire in the second half of the 19th century had no perceivable immediate enemy, it still felt cautious, paranoid, and ready that at any time this jewel of the Pacific, Sydney Harbour, which at this point was starting to really take off as an international trading port, a great city in which so many people had made their fortunes, needed to be protected if push came to shove. Then in the year 1870, one of the most significant events in terms of Sydney's defence preparations occurred. Once again, it was not a foreign enemy entering the harbour, in fact quite the opposite. It was the mass and sudden withdrawal of British soldiers during the period of the Caldwell reforms, where British troops were being recalled from their posts all over the British Empire to consolidate forces back in the UK. Ever since 1788, Sydney had been guarded by regiment after regiment from the motherland, and now, all of a sudden, in the 1870s, it was left to defend for itself. Of course, the last thing that Sydney wanted was to suddenly be caught unawares and unprepared if an attack now came when Sydney no longer had its grand protector here. This new era of self-dependence for Sydney led to all sorts of new strategies and defence fortifications being erected around the harbour. The most substantial of these forts were found at Middle Harbour and at George's Heights. Both of these tall sandstone cliffed headlands were the obvious choice for an improvement of the outer line of defence, with sweeping range over the entrance of the harbour. The early defence activity that had begun by convicts in 1801 to 1803 was due for a grand transformation. Rigorous work started in 1871 at George's Heights. Here the colonial architect James Barnett designed a heavily fortified sandstone command centre known as the Gunners' Barracks, and 250 workers as well as engineers and military personnel would carve into the plateau of natural sandstone atop George's Heights to create an intricate series of tunnels. These solid stone tunnels and chambers then linked the Gunners' Barracks, which was equipped with large magazines for gunpowder and other stations, with 6 enormous circular gun pits carved directly into the sandstone facing the harbour. The George's Head gun pits were then armed with 4 80-pounder rifled muzzle-loading guns, which could rotate, and another 2 68-pounder guns. These cannons were able to rotate and had a maximum range of up to 4.5 miles. The 80-pounders were so long and large that it took 3 months and over 200 soldiers to roll the guns from North Sydney along a rough bush track to their placement at George's Heights. This route to the defence bases in the area would become known as Military Road, and today it still serves as the main artery of traffic along the ridge of the North Shore. However, there were major faults in the design of this battery. In particular, the guns were positioned so poorly that there was a risk that they could fire upon each other. The battery was also clearly visible from the waters at the entrance of the harbour, and little protection had been built for the men if they were fired back upon. On advice from visiting British military experts, modifications were made to this fortress, and at the same time, in the 1870s and 80s, another extensive fort complex was constructed out of solid stone and concrete at a strategic location at Middle Harbour, giving it a strong defensive position not only for the entrance of Port Jackson but also the northern branches of the waterway. The Middle Harbour Battery, which is largely still intact today, involved an extensive network of tunnels, ancillary rooms, gunpowder magazines, and a disappearing gun emplacement. The site was fitted with its own power generator, and a large permanent squadron of Australia's first defence forces were stationed there, adding improvements and technical additions all the way from the 1870s till 1911. And even many years later, during the Vietnam War, the maze of sandstone tunnels of Middle Harbour were used by Australian soldiers for tactical training in underground warfare. But returning to the 1880s, which as you'll remember is 100 years into the colonial story of Sydney and the defences of its harbour, Sydney was now equipped with 41 large gun emplacements, not only placed at the north side of the harbour, but also at Shark Point, and with several fortifications on the inner and outer cliffs of the South Head. All of these defence batteries were then linked by telephone cables which ran overland and underneath the harbour to a central command post at Georges Heights, which had direct links to the Sydney Phone Exchange in the middle of the city. But as Sydney entered the last decade of the 19th century, improvements in technology would see a radical shift in the defence strategy of the water of the harbour itself. While the first 100 years had focused on creating strongholds with cannons ready to fire on enemy ships from above, the 1890s would see the emergence of a specialty corps known as the submarine miners. The submarine miners can be a little confusing in today's terminology because it did not refer to actual submarines. It referred to the use of underwater explosives that were elsewhere known as naval mines, controlled naval mines, or aqua mines. The submarine miners were a highly trained, secretive and special unit who were tasked with the manufacture, maintenance and installation of hundreds of underwater explosives. Replicating the types of mines manufactured at Portsmouth in the UK, the explosive material loaded into the mines was known as gun cotton or sometimes wet cotton. Its technical name is nitrocellulose. It was manufactured and used almost solely for underwater explosives by mixing a formula of nitric acid and sulfuric acid and soaking it in cotton, then carefully storing it in alcohol. All that was needed to detonate this highly explosive material was a sudden flash of heat, and this spark could be easily generated by zapping an electrical current into the bomb itself. The power of gun cotton made it very suitable for blasting. As a projectile driver, it had around 6 times the gas generation of an equal volume of black powder and produced less smoke and less heating. The shells of the mines, which held the gun cotton inside, were basically giant iron canisters which looked like big trash cans. Depending on the depth that they would be placed, some mines were cylindrical and others were spherical. Either way, the bottom of the object would be linked to a chain supporting a heavy anchor at the end, while into the top of the shell of the mine would be electrical cables protected in rubber tubing that would link the mine itself from its position underwater to a detonation command centre at Georges Heights. The positions of the minefields, which were anchored at several key places in the harbour, were maintained in secret by the submarine miners from their headquarters and base, which was another extensive military complex designed in the 1890s at Chowder Bay, just below the command centre of the Gunners Barracks and Georges Heights. As a corps, the submarine miners were paid double the annual salary of any other branch of the Army, as each member had to qualify from exams to prove they were a specialist pyrotechnician and electrician, and carry out their dangerous work both above and underwater. Now, with the construction of the submarine miners facility at Chowder Bay, and the public of Sydney, particularly those that spent time on the harbour, whether recreationally or crossing it by ferry, starting to get a little bit nervous about the idea that there were underwater explosives being laid in undisclosed locations, perhaps right where you might be fishing for the day, and with the technology of utilising electricity as a detonator, which was really brand new in the world of marine warfare, the military officials at the time in charge of the secretive submarine mining operations decided in 1891, just as their defensive strategy was getting started, to try and put the public and the press's mind at ease by organising a public demonstration of both the safety and the efficiency of this explosive technique. As this was a controlled mine rather than just an underwater bomb that would blast the moment it was knocked, it was felt that a complete operation showcasing the transportation of the mines, which were housed at Chowder Bay in a bunker, out onto a specialty steamer and into the middle of the harbour, where the submarine miners could install the explosive underneath an old fishing boat ready for detonation, which would of course also demonstrate the immense power that these bombs could achieve, which in the case of an attack was all about blowing up battleships when they attempted to pass over the right coordinates of these underwater explosives. And so, Colonel Wolski ordered that this display would take place at an assigned time. The press, some of the public, but mostly military officials could come to view the demonstration from the headlands of several parts of the North Shore, and it was planned for several bombs to be detonated. Of course, when the word got out that blasts were going to take place on the harbour using these new secret weapons that were lying below, thousands of people gathered on the headlands trying to catch a glimpse, and several last-minute changes to the demonstration were ordered by Colonel Wolski upon his boys. But as had been planned, 12 men took out several bombs from the bunker at Chowder Bay, slowly lowered them by crane onto their steamer, and with a large area of water cordoned off for their purposes, they quickly installed one of the mines underneath a fishing boat and moved their steamer well away so that it could be detonated through the electronic cable to the mine from a safe distance. What happened next was a very public disaster. I'll read a quote from the 4th of April 1891 from the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper. "Without warning, a terrific explosion took place, not at the spot where the mine had been cast. Fragments of wood and other debris rose in the air, and the mass of water, which at the same time was thrown skywards, instead of being clear, was tinged with crimson. Nothing more was needed to convince the spectators that a disaster had befallen the men in the cutter, and the conviction brought with it a feeling of horror." Another newspaper article, this time from Hobart in Tasmania, would have the title, "Frightful Disaster in Sydney Harbour, Volunteers Blown to Pieces with Gun Cotton. An accident unparalleled in the history of the colony for frightful nature occurred this afternoon in connection with the Middle Harbour Middle Head, resulting in the death of 4 men and injuring 8 others." What had occurred? Well, it simply seems that the cable of detonation was attached to the wrong bomb, and instead of the explosion taking place underwater and blowing up the unmanned fishing boat, the mine that actually detonated was sitting right next to the submarine miners on their steamer, meaning that the 4 men sitting closest to the blast were killed instantly, while the other 8 men were thrown off their craft into the water amidst the debris and floated mostly unconscious, until one of them, a young corporal named Borland, came to his senses and managed to fish all of his men onto the remaining part of their steamer, a task that he had to complete alone because all of the other responders had been kept well away from the blast of the demonstration. As you can imagine, this was an enormous tragedy. Sydney had never actually been attacked, but in the process of defending it, 4 lives had been lost, and the very foundations of the defensive strategies were shaken to their core. An investigation would eventually lay much of the blame on the haphazard preparations ordered by Colonel Wolski, and essentially the inexperience of the men tasked with this job. A large obelisk commemorating the men was erected in one of the graveyards of Sydney, which still stands, and an enormous and very public outpouring of grief came from across Australia to support the families of those who had been lost in attempting to defend Sydney Harbour. From that point onwards, no public demonstrations of the power and capability of these mines were ever put to the test, although regular operations to ensure that the bombs were working correctly would take place in secret around the harbour, and operations would continue at Chowder Bay, connected and corresponding with the command centre at Georges Heights, all the way up until 1922. But with the turn of the 20th century, many of the armed sandstone fortresses that Sydney had implemented from its colonial conception were deemed to be outdated or rather useless. Their fixed positions and old-fashioned cannons obviously wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight compared to an armed battleship of the 20th century. Sydney would witness the strength and power of such battleships when in 1908 the American Great White Fleet visited our harbour. The Great White Fleet was a popular nickname for a squadron of 16 battleships that completed a journey to naval ports around the world between 1907 and 1909 by order of President Theodore Roosevelt. The fleet's primary mission was to make friendly courtesy visits to numerous countries while displaying new US naval power to the world. Roosevelt sought to demonstrate growing American military prowess and blue water naval capabilities. Another goal was to deter a threatened war with Japan amid growing tensions around 1900. The voyage helped familiarise the 14,500 officers and sailors with the logistical and planning needs for extended fleet action far from home. The impressive arrival of this fleet, with their hulls painted white, into Sydney Harbour in 1908 was used to encourage support for the forming of Australia's own navy, remembering that up until 1901 there was no Australian Defence Force because Australia had not been a federated nation. It had been a series of colonies, meaning that New South Wales was in charge of protecting itself, and likewise other colonies, Victoria and Queensland, did the same. As was expected, the visit of the Great White Fleet led to public enthusiasm for the formation of a modern Australian Navy, and immediately led to the order of two 700-ton River-class torpedo boat destroyers, with the UK keeping a weary eye on the surge of German naval construction in 1909. Sure enough, by 1910, the Naval Defence Act was passed, marking the official formation of Australia's Navy. By 1913, the Australian fleet, which consisted of the battlecruiser Australia, the cruisers Melbourne and Sydney, as well as 3 torpedo boat destroyers, entered Sydney Harbour for the first time. And in that same year, 1913, one of the islands in Sydney Harbour, the largest in fact, Cockatoo Island, which had been fitted with a dry dock and used for industrial shipbuilding throughout the second half of the 19th century, was handed over to the Commonwealth Government of Australia, becoming the naval dockyard of the Royal Australian Navy. At its peak during World War I, at least 4,000 men were employed on shipbuilding projects at the island, and over this period, at least 2,000 ships were docked there. But Australia's contribution in the First World War far exceeded its efforts to build ships at Cockatoo Island. Despite being a newly federated nation, Australia's loyalty to Great Britain and its willingness to answer the call for military support led towards an enormous war effort, especially considering how many soldiers enlisted to go and fight overseas. Australia's total population at the time was about 4 million, and of that, 416,809 enlisted for service, representing 38.7% of the total male population aged between 18 and 44. And of those enlisted, nearly 60,000 would die fighting battles well away from Australia, while another 160,000 or so would return wounded by the end of the war. While so many Australian soldiers would see action at the fronts in Europe, in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, particularly in Turkey, and in other places around the world, on the home front, Australia's war effort revolved much more around supporting its forces fighting abroad. At sea, the Royal Australian Navy worked closely with its allies, and Australian warships effectively searched for enemy raiders over thousands of miles of ocean. They also carried out anti-submarine warfare, escorted convoys of merchant ships carrying supplies and troops, experimented with the use of seaplanes, and continued to sweep for mines in home waters, and continue to carry out long routine patrols as requested by the British Admiralty, especially in blockading enemy ports. At the end of the war, Australia as a physical place had remained largely unscathed and its coastal borders had remained protected. Sydney's harbour defences had continued to rely on the underwater laying of mines, but its old sandstone forts with their large cannons pointed out to the entrance at the harbour were largely scaled back, as were other coastal defences, due to the fact that Australian battleships lay in wait in Sydney Harbour and were continuously being built and repaired at Cockatoo Island, and as they were heavily armed, mobile and up to date with technology, would prove much more effective against any local attack than the old-fashioned forts that Sydney had relied on in the past. And so it was by the 1920s, despite all of Sydney's preparations and decades of anxiety over its defences, still a strike on Sydney had never taken place. There had, however, been one incident in the harbour which had caused a bit of a stir at the time. This took place in October in the year 1900, just as the Boer War in South Africa raged. At that time, the White Star Line ship SS Medic sailed into Sydney Harbour and dropped anchor in Neutral Bay. And one night, the fourth officer of this ship, a Mr. Charles Lightoller, and 2 shipmates rowed ashore to Fort Denison. Now you remember that Fort Denison was once upon a time a rocky little island in the centre of the harbour, which had been redeveloped over the Crimean War for fears of a Russian invasion into Sydney Harbour, and turned into quite a unique garrison with its thick cylindrical Martello sandstone tower. Upon reaching Fort Denison, these cheeky sailors climbed to the top of the tower with a plan to fool the locals of Sydney into believing that a Boer raiding party was attacking its city. they hoisted a makeshift boa flag on the lightning conductor, and then using one of the 8-inch cannons on the fortress island, they used gunpowder to fire out a wad of cotton into the water. Of course, this didn't really do any damage, except the blast shattering a few of the fort's windows, and Lightoller was never apprehended at the time, but he confessed to his superiors and then related the whole story later on in an autobiography. And in fact, he turned out to be a pretty interesting fellow with quite the life story. He was transferred to the Atlantic route of the White Star Line and went on to be the second officer of the RMS Titanic. He was actually the most senior officer to survive the 1912 sinking of the famous ship, and he was a key witness of both the British and American inquiries into the disaster. At least these days, Fort Denison still remains just as it was, an early fortification in the harbour of Sydney, while many other of these former fortresses and batteries now lie in a state of ruin, often taken over by the bush, while some others are now just a distant memory. This includes the infamous Fort Macquarie. After completion in the early 1820s, this iconic sea fort remained at the end of Bennelong Point through the entirety of the 19th century, while all around it the port town of Sydney grew into a bustling city, and so many ships would pass by, seeing it as something of a relic of the past. As it aged, it looked like something from a medieval ruin, and was captured in many paintings and photos, especially given its position at Sydney Cove. Eventually, the waters just around the fortress itself were reclaimed. Its bridge became useless, and it sat rather awkwardly on an extended stone wharf around the headland. By the late 1890s, given the fact it had never fired an aggressive shot, although it had been involved in many commemorative and celebrative cannon firings, it was decided that the old fortress should be taken down, and in its place a tram depot would be constructed. This was basically an industrial warehouse for trams to terminate in, called the Fort Macquarie Tram Depot, and would reside there from the early 1900s till the late 1950s. At this point, Sydney got rid of its tram lines, and the defunct building was knocked down, only to be replaced with, you guessed it, the Sydney Opera House. And in many ways, the iconic white sails of the Opera House, which really stand out on that headland, was a hark back to the previous era where that fortress had stood tall and was seen by every incoming ship as they entered Sydney Cove. But returning our timeline to the 1920s, while like the rest of the world, Sydney would enjoy the roaring interwar years, and much would change in technology, society and culture, Sydney, now a big bustling international city, was still well aware that its harbour was a prized jewel in the South Pacific, and its defence strategies should not remain dormant. During the 1920s, several more well-constructed fortifications, which utilised more up-to-date and longer-range weaponry, were constructed, especially on the north and south headlands facing the Pacific Ocean, and at the same time, military shipbuilding and repairs continued to be undertaken at a busy rate at Cockatoo Island. Australia's navy was strengthened all the way along the coast, but without immediate threats in its vicinity, Sydney was kept much busier trying to tackle crime in the city as rival gangs sought power over the underworld in the 1920s and 30s, rather than focusing all of its strengths on protection of the harbour. But at the same time, an enormous transformation would take place with the construction of Sydney Harbour Bridge. This would be an engineering achievement unparalleled in the history of colonial Australia thus far. Completed after nearly a decade of blood, sweat, tears and even fatalities, the Sydney Harbour Bridge would achieve an arch span of 1,654 feet and at its summit rise 440 feet above mean sea level. And aside from anything else, the Harbour Bridge installed itself as an incredible icon of the city, as it still is today, and especially in the 1930s, in the midst of the Depression, when it was completed, it instantly became one of the great engineering icons of the world. But of course, like everywhere else, this era of optimism and peace would come to a bitter end with the outbreak of the Second World War. Interestingly enough, Sydney had kept a keen eye on movements in the Pacific, and whilst of course its location down under placed it a world away from uprisings in Nazi Germany, by the late 1930s the Australian Defence Force, and in particular the Navy, found itself becoming increasingly weary about Japanese expansion into the Pacific. And while Sydney felt relatively safe with its warships on hand, as naval vessels became increasingly large and complex, it became clear that the facilities of Cockatoo Island were not quite up to scratch. One thing they did not possess was a graving dock. Graving docks were essential to the maintenance and repairs of heavy-duty military ships. They allowed for a large vessel to be floated into a dock and then the basin of that dock to be drained of water so the ship could be stationed on a dry platform and receive all sorts of maintenance and repairs necessary before the basin was reflooded and the ship could float out. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, the nearest sizable naval graving dock was at Singapore Naval Base, which was at least an 8,000 nautical mile journey for a potentially damaged warship from Sydney. This kicked the Royal Navy into gear, and after lots of debate and discussion, the site was chosen by the Australian government to reclaim an island off the coast of a headland within Sydney Harbour and transform it into the Captain Cook Graving Dock. This island was called Garden Island, and from the very beginnings of colonial Sydney in 1788, had been used as a garden to try and grow veggies for the very first colonists. Its location in the harbour was just off the very fashionable suburb of Potts Point. The Navy's plan, which was put into action, was to construct a graving dock within the waters that separated the headland of Potts Point with Garden Island. This would effectively extend the mainland so the island was no more, but given its strategic location and the ability of ships of all sizes to be able to dock and be repaired here, by 1940, Garden Island, the naval base that still serves Sydney today, would take over as the major complex which would dock and repair not only Australian battleships, but those of the Allied navies. Once again, over the Second World War, so much of Australia's focus would be on battles overseas. However, by the 1940s, it became increasingly clear that this was going to be different. While once again many Australians were fighting in the fronts of Europe and North Africa, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbour on the 7th of December 1941 would not only mark a turning point for the involvement of the United States in World War II, but would also bring battles into the Pacific in a way that Australia had never experienced before. As the Japanese Imperial Army continued to invade south, suddenly the once isolated continent of Australia was open to immediate threat, and to whom would it turn to defend its borders? I don't think it can be ever understated that the incredible effort by the American military defence forces, not only to come to the aid of Australia in its hour of need around the Pacific, but also to utilise the defence bases and ship docks that we already had structured. And as is well known, this would include so many battles on land, at sea and in air, in and around the tiny Pacific islands that were just north of Australia as the Japanese forces continued to push their way south. Thus, by the early 1940s, Garden Island in Sydney Harbour, now the command centre of Sydney's naval defences, and the graving dock where many Australian battleships as well as other Allied naval ships were stationed both for the defence of Sydney and for repairs, would find itself suddenly being an important international naval base and a target for Japanese forces. By February 19th, 1942, the conflict of World War II exploded onto mainland Australia with the Japanese bombing of Darwin. Japanese fighters and bombers attacked the port and shipping of the harbour twice during the day, killing 252 Allied service personnel and civilians. Tensions ran high around the country. The enemy was at our doorstep, and Sydney started to take its harbour defences ever more seriously. But now, in the 1940s, and considering the lessons learnt from the First World War, particularly in naval battles, it was all too clear that an attack by sea would not always come by ship. Just as the Allied forces in the Atlantic continued to face the stealthy destruction of the German U-boats, the threat of a Japanese submarine attack on Sydney would see our harbour defences shift gear to prepare themselves for an entirely new type of invasion, one that may try and strike in secret from below the still waters of Sydney Harbour. And so the stage was set, and as we've discussed so far, since Sydney's colonial beginning, it had readied itself for a potential attack entering its harbour from the Pacific Ocean. And now finally, over 150 years after Sydney had developed its very first defence batteries in the harbour, An attack was on its way. Having anticipated what kind of attack it would be, and especially after the bombing of Darwin and the impending threat of a Japanese attack, probably by submarine, Sydney Harbour's defence measures had increased in vigilance. For the first time, the most outer line of defence had actually been established outside the headlands of Sydney Harbour. This was in the form of 6 anti-submarine indicator loops. Invented during the First World War, anti-submarine indicator loops were essentially established as a warning system. They relied on underwater cables, usually laid out along the ocean floor, to give off a warning signal via electric currents and magnetism if and when a metal vessel passed over a specific shipping channel. If an indicator loop signaled that a vessel had passed over its location and the activation of the indicator loop did not correspond to the passage of a friendly or known ship over that location, then of course this sent alarm bells. Then this of course indicated that perhaps a stealthy submarine was passing by without visible detection from the surface. Not only had Sydney installed 6 anti-submarine loops at several locations outside the entrance headlands to our harbour, but by 1942 it had also installed one between the north and south head and one between the south head and the middle head of the harbour. But of course these were just warning systems. The major physical defensive strategy was the installation of anti-submarine boom nets in Sydney Harbour. Funnily enough, the installation of protective boom nets was not an unfamiliar concept to Sydneysiders at the time. In fact, during the 1930s, during a period of horrific shark attacks both in the harbour and at the beaches surrounding Sydney, a government program to establish anti-shark boom nets had been implemented at many popular swimming locations. Only this time, in the 1940s, to protect Sydney Harbour from a possible submarine invasion, the netting of these defences would be woven out of steel netting by the Navy. Woven together at the naval base of Garden Island, the enormous sections of boom netting were made out of wire and interlocking steel rings, which were about 450 millimetres each in diameter. Construction on the boom commenced in January 1942, just 1 month before the attack on Darwin. And after this attack, production would speed up dramatically. The net itself would need to stretch across the harbour from the north to the south shore, once again to protect the interior waters of the harbour, which surrounded Sydney Cove, by now called Circular Quay, and the city of Sydney itself. The strategic vantage point of George's Head would mark the northern reach of the boom net, which would stretch right across the watery passage of the harbour to the southern shore to a headland known as Green Point. But importantly, the boom net needed to accommodate for 2 passage channels. These were known as the Eastern Channel and the Western Channel and the Eastern Channel. The intended span of the boom net across its location in the harbour was just under 5,000 feet in length. But to allow the passage of regular shipping, especially daily ferries, and on occasion enormous battleships, the boom gates could be opened using a hauling ferry. It was the smaller eastern gate that was open regularly for ferries and commercial shipping, while the larger and less used western gate that needed a wider and deeper passage from one side of the harbour to another. The central and western sections of the boom consisted of some 49 clusters of 4 wooden piles, whilst the eastern section of the boom net was supported by a row of floating buoys. The gates, which were open and closed by tugboats, were tightly controlled, but they could either be hauled back or submerged underwater to open the gates and allow ships to pass through, using both tugboats and winches. The steel rings of the boom netting created an underwater mesh that had been designed not only to prevent the entrance of midget submarines, but would also act as a blockade against any torpedoes shot into the harbour. The only trouble with this boom net line of defence was that large sections of this netting were still incomplete. At least this was the case by May 1942, when the net was needed most. Missing gaps in the net to the west and the eastern side of the central section had yet to be installed, allowing for openings of up to 1,300 feet, All that was needed was to know these weak spots and penetrate inside the harbour by avoiding the central section and sneaking through the sides. It was material shortages rather than a lack of concern that had led to the delays in the completion of the total perimeter of netting, and whilst wooden piles had been laid in preparation on the western side, the new strategies for Sydney's harbour defence systems over this Second World War seemed to be too little, too late. There was also an issue of manpower, and whilst the anti-submarine indicator loops had been laid, they were in fact, by May 1942, largely inactive. Control centres that were meant to observe and act if there was any indication submarines had passed over these lines were not adequately staffed, and due to the frequent false alarms which these loops had recorded ever since their installation in the early 1940s, largely due to commercial shipping setting them off, their readings, even if very significant, were often ignored or not logged at all. But it wasn't just these two static defence systems that Sydney relied on in the event that it would be attacked by submarine. In terms of mobile defensive crafts that were located in the harbour, by May 1942, these included the anti-submarine vessels and 2 auxiliary minesweepers, as well as 6 civilian vessels that had been converted into channel boat patrols and were armed with depth charges. Finally, there were also 4 unarmed naval auxiliary patrol boats. The naval officer in charge of Sydney Harbour at the time was Rear Admiral Gerard Moorhead Gould of the Royal Navy. And by the 31st of May 1942, the major vessels of war present in Sydney Harbour were the heavy cruisers USS Chicago and HMAS Canberra, both of these being large, important and well-equipped battleships that had made port in Sydney Harbour after active service and patrols in the Pacific Ocean. There was also the light cruiser HMAS Adelaide, the destroyer tender USS Doblin, auxiliary mine layer HMAS Bungaree, corvettes HMAS Whyalla, HMAS Geelong, and from the Indian Navy HMIS Bombay. 2 other merchant cruisers had been armed, and as will be very significant, a converted ferry, the HMAS Cuttable, sat alongside Garden Island, where she served as a temporary barracks for sailors that were transferring between ships. However, this veteran submarine, launched by the Royal Netherlands Navy in 1922, was already 20 years behind its powerful new German and Japanese counterparts. For instance, the 11 motherships of the 8th Submarine Squadron belonging to Japan were massive 392-foot-long vessels with crews of up to 95 men. They were also equipped to carry midget submarines strapped to their deck. And whilst we'll refer to them as midget submarines, they were in fact at least 85 feet long and weighed almost 50 tons. Each carried 2 torpedoes and could accommodate, although rather tightly, 2 men inside. The Japanese Navy had used 5 of these Ko-Hayateki class midget submarines in an unsuccessful operation against US battleships during the attack of Pearl Harbor. Learning lessons from their failed operations at Pearl Harbor, these midget submarines had been upgraded and crews intensely trained in their operations. The motherships of the 8th Submarine Squadron, which could launch these midget submarines to selected ports, were ordered by the 16th of December 1941 to carry out simultaneous attacks against Allied naval vessels in the Indian and South Pacific Oceans. After a secret reconnaissance flight conducted over Sydney Harbour on the 17th of February by a Japanese light plane, as well as also over the Australian harbours of Melbourne and Hobart, Sydney was selected as the final target for a midget submarine attack, and by May 1942, 5 of the Japanese mothership submarines would form an attack fleet which stationed themselves off the east coast of Australia in a position about 10 miles from Sydney Harbour. 2 of these motherships, 3 of these motherships would possess midget submarines, while the other 2 carried small Japanese float planes which could be launched by the mothership submarines at sea to make reconnaissance flights over targets prior to the final attack. With Sydney Harbour and its base of Allied warships stationed at Garden Island now chosen as the Japanese target, 2 reconnaissance flights by float planes launched by the motherships waiting off the coast would prepare the way for the midget submarine invasion. The first floatplane reconnaissance mission over Sydney took place on the 23rd of May. And whilst this flight was detected by a secret radar station that was recently installed at Iron Cove within Sydney Harbour, unfortunately the authorities in Sydney dismissed its report as a glitch, but the reconnaissance flight had managed to observe not only the weak points in Sydney Harbour's defensive, including the wide gaps that were still present in Sydney's anti-submarine boom net, but it also confirmed the sighting of major battleships located in Sydney Harbour, as well as other cruisers and minor war vessels, which would form the objects targeted by the final attack. Then, 6 days later, just before dawn, on the 29th of May 1942, one last reconnaissance mission by the remaining Japanese floatplane would take place and was observed by many civilian and military witnesses in Sydney. However, even though it had been spotted over Garden Island and was recording the final position of warships as well as the route that the midget submarines would take over the boom net, it was assumed by those who saw it to be a US Navy Curtiss Seagull, which was a small Allied aircraft that was often observed flying over the city. However, just as dawn was breaking in Sydney that morning, the military realised that the only ship in the area carrying US Seagulls was the US cruiser Chicago, and all 4 of her aircraft were still on board her deck. Thus, an alarm was raised, and fighters from the Richmond Air Force Base, located just west of the city of Sydney, launched several fighters to search for the potential enemy aircraft or any sign of submarines off the coast. But their search efforts were unsuccessful and no further action was taken. And so the day had finally come, and the first attack on Sydney in the history of the harbour would commence on the evening of the 31st of May 1942. The Japanese plan of attack was to launch 3 midget submarines from their motherships about 5 to 7 nautical miles out to sea, just off the Sydney coastline. These midget subs would be launched between 5:20 and 5:40 p.m. and attempt to enter Sydney one after another, with their final targets to be determined by the commanding officer, one of 2 men that were squeezed inside each vessel. Heavy ocean swell ended up causing delays by over an hour, but by 8:01 p.m, the first midget submarine, known as M14, would silently make its way over Sydney's anti-submarine indicator loops located outside the headlands of Sydney Harbour, which in fact were pointless at the time because they were inactive, and yet it would be detected by a reading of the underwater indicator loop that stretched between South Head and Middle Head. Despite this reading, the signal given by the loop was dismissed, as it was thought to be yet another false alarm caused by heavy civilian traffic in the harbour at that time. This first submarine then attempted to try and make its way through the gap at the western end of Sydney's protective boom net, and despite aiming for the right location, the submarine collided with the pile light which had been installed in preparation for the net to be completed. Upon striking this unexpected object, the sub was spotted by a maritime service board watchman at 8:15 p.m. It seems the vessel then tried to reverse and re-enter by navigating around the pile light, but instead managed to trap its stern in part of the boom net which had been completed. This caused the submarine's bow to break the surface of the water, and the watchman rowed towards it to try and determine what it was, before swiftly rowing to the nearby patrol boat, the HMAS Yarima, to report his finding. Despite his immediate vigilance, due to a sloppy chain of communication, this message was not passed on to Naval Headquarters for at least an hour and a half. Close to 10 p.m, 2 patrol boats went to investigate and found that the vessel, which was described by those on duty as a baby submarine, was still stuck in the boom net as its propeller had become caught in the rings of the wiring. The Sydney patrol boats realised they could therefore attempt to destroy the submarine by dropping depth charges. A depth charge is an anti-submarine warfare weapon designed to destroy submarines by detonating in the water near the target and subjecting it to a destructive hydraulic shock. Most depth charges use high explosives with a fuse set to detonate the charge, which is set to explode at a certain depth of water. Developed during the First World War and used widely in World War II, depth charges became one of the first viable methods at attacking submarines underwater and were usually launched by fast active ships from the surface of the water if submarines were thought to be lurking below. But due to the shallowness of the water at the point where this first submarine had become caught in the net, the depth charges that were deployed for the hydrostatic fuse settings to detonate the explosives. However, upon realizing that their situation was hopeless, the 2 crewmen trapped in this midget submarine would activate their own self-destructive scuttling charges in effect blowing up themselves and their midget sub instead of facing capture or the threat of more depth charges with shallower settings being dropped upon them. As well as killing themselves, this action would destroy the front section of the submarine, which then sunk to the bottom of Sydney Harbour. In the meantime, the man in charge of Sydney Harbour's defences, Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould, sounded the general alarm that one or more enemy submarines may be attempting to attack Sydney in the harbour. This included orders and advice for Allied ships to take up anti-submarine precautions. However, it had already been over 2 hours since this first submarine was spotted, and in the aftermath of the attack, the Rear Admiral as well as other senior command would be highly criticised for their lack of immediate action and incompetence, especially when it was revealed that Muirhead Gould had been hosting a dinner party on the night of the attack, and one of the main guests was the senior United States Navy officer in Sydney Harbour, Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago. And it had taken at least until midnight for the Rear Admiral to come aboard one of the patrol boats, where he and Captain Bode were both reported to be intoxicated from their dinner party, and instead of taking the situation seriously, were highly sceptical of the accounts of sailors on board this patrol boat and chastised their responses as well as dismissing their reports. Prior to this alarm and the activity of those in command, the second midget submarine, known as M24, had also entered the harbour undetected, and whilst it set off an indicator loop at 9:48 and even grazed the hull of a small Australian vessel on its way in, once again these reports were not followed up upon. In a bold move, this second midget submarine successfully tailgated a Sydney ferry returning from Manly to Circular Quay, which had been given clear access for the boom gate to be opened and for it to pass through with the submarine in tow. Because of the delays, sloppy communication, and perhaps even drunken indifference by those in command who hadn't yet raised the alarm. Having now breached the boom net following the ferry by about 10 p.m, the submarine's whereabouts were unknown until 10:52, when it was spotted by a searchlight operator on board the USS Chicago. By this point, it was located less than 1,600 feet to the Chicago's starboard side, which was moored at Garden Island, Sydney's Naval Defence Command Centre, and was the primary target of the Japanese attack. The Chicago then opened fire with a 5-inch gun and 4 other mounted machine guns, but no real damage was caused to the submarine as the artillery couldn't penetrate deep enough into the water. Funnily enough, however, several of the 5-inch shells which had been fired by the Chicago skipped off the water and struck the Martello Tower at Fort Denison. The damage caused by these shells on this ancient Sydney fortress is still visible today, and it means that the first shelling unloaded on Sydney's harbour's defences was actually inflicted by friendly fire of our US allies at the time, and other shells were later found in the North Shore suburbs of Cremorne and Mossman, but luckily didn't cause any real damage to these residential neighbourhoods that were caught in the crossfire. But it now being about 11 p.m, and the Chicago realising that it may be under threat by several attacking submarines, orders were given by the senior officer on board to begin preparing from departure of Sydney Harbour, and for a US anti-submarine patrol cruiser to start screening for vessels. Strangely, by the time that Captain Howard Bode, the man in charge of USS Chicago, boarded his ship at around 11:30 and was sceptical of the reports he received about the dangers that these submarines, which had been spotted and did carry torpedoes, now posed on his ship. The commanders of other defence vessels on the harbour were taking the situation very seriously, and for many more hours an aquatic game of cat and mouse would take place as patrol boats armed with depth charge and other anti-torpedo crews attempted to track down these stealthy submarines, who in turn were trying to position themselves within striking range of their targets to deploy their torpedoes. After being fired upon by USS Chicago as well as 2 other Australian patrol boats, M24, which was that second submarine to enter the harbour, managed to escape those trying to track it down and found a hiding spot thought to be in one of the deepest crevices of Sydney Harbour, which is close to 120 feet under the waters nearby the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Here it waited patiently for its chance to attack, but by this stage a third midget submarine had passed over the indicator loops and made its way through the headlands of the harbour towards its plan to try and bypass the boom net. However, the conning tower of the midget submarine was spotted by an unarmed Naval Auxiliary patrol boat, which quickly sent an alert signal to the port of war signal station at South Head. This was acted upon by another anti-submarine vessel which attempted to ram the submarine, lost contact in the collision before regaining it at 11:03 p.m. and then unloaded its full pattern of 6 depth charges. It was thought at the time that these explosives had destroyed or at least damaged the vessel, but it's now believed that midget submarine M21 escaped the depth charge blasts and managed to lay low by returning to a position deep underwater outside the Sydney Heads. So to recap, by about 11:15 p.m, which was 3 hours after the first midget sub had been spotted accidentally ramming into one of the pile lights of the unfinished boom net and subsequently self-destructed, 2 midget submarines were still unaccounted for, one of which, M24, had been lying in wait deep under the Sydney Harbour Bridge, while M21 was most likely loitering just outside the headlands, having escaped the depth charges laid upon it. The 3 enormous motherships that had deployed these midget subs had now moved to a rendezvous position off the coastline of Port Hacking, south of Sydney. And now that Sydney Harbour was clearly under attack, every armed and unarmed naval vessel that Sydney had at its disposal was frantically scouring the waters, and upon orders of the Rear Admiral, all ships were to observe blackout conditions. However, as will be recounted later, despite going to personally observe the boom net on board a patrol boat, by about 11:30, Rear Admiral Moorhead Gould was still not taking this reported attack by enemy submarines seriously. Upon boarding the HMAS Lolita, a patrol boat, he was reported as saying, "What are you all playing at, running up and down the harbour, dropping depth charges and talking about enemy subs? There's not one to be seen." And then before leaving his brief inspection, reportedly added sarcastically, "And if you see another sub, see if the captain has a black beard. I'd like to meet him." But in less than an hour after these helpful comments had been made by the Commander-in-Chief of Sydney Harbour Defences, a tremendous explosion took place at Navy Central Command on Garden Island. It was a torpedo launched by midget submarine M24. After hiding in the deep waters of the harbour, it had repositioned itself just west of Fort Denison, and now with a clear line of sight of its major target, the USS Chicago, it had fired one of its torpedoes. And to this day, the exact path that this torpedo took is still disputed. The one thing that historians can agree on is that its target was certainly the USS Chicago, which at the time was in the last moments of making its preparations to depart Garden Island and sail out of the harbour altogether. But instead of hitting its target, its first torpedo shot, which also was the very first ballistic shot on Sydney altogether, glided underneath the Dutch submarine KIX and just below the converted Sydney ferry HMAS Cuttable, which, as mentioned, had been converted into a barrack ship accommodating at least 30 sailors who were fast asleep on board at the time. This torpedo would not directly hit any vessels, but instead it would strike the stone wharf wall of Garden Island to which the HMAS Cuttable was moored. The explosion would immediately split the Cuttable in two. 19 Australian sailors and 2 from the British Royal Navy would drown in the blast as the Cuttable suddenly sunk to the bottom of the harbour. Another 10 which managed to swim ashore would be gravely wounded. The blast would also immediately knock out all telecommunications on the command centre of Garden Island and cause minor damage to structures located on the wharf. After regaining its equilibrium, midget submarine M24 would then fire its second torpedo, but in missing its warship target and found itself landing submerged on the shoreline of Garden Island and luckily didn't explode. Midget sub M24 then dived and made its escape out of the harbour. A crossing over the indicator loop at 1:58 a.m, recording now being taken seriously, was thought to be yet a 4th submarine entering the harbour to attack. Later analysis showed it was an outbound sub, which was determined as the exit time of the mysterious M24 sub after its lethal blow, a blow that, while missing its main target, had resulted in the loss of 21 Allied lives and had actively proved that Sydney Harbour's defences were clearly inadequate. After this blow had been dealt, the primary warship stationed at Garden Island quickly made arrangements to depart the harbour. The USS Chicago left her anchorage at 2:14 a.m. The ship was in such a hurried state to leave that it accidentally left a sailor behind on the mooring buoy. At the same time, other ships, the Bombay, the Whyalla, the Canberra and Perkins, all began to make their preparations to depart. Just before 3 a.m, as the USS Chicago was leaving the headlands of Sydney Harbour, its lookout spotted a submarine periscope passing alongside the cruiser. This was most likely the third midget sub, M21, which was now attempting to re-enter the harbour, having waited patiently underwater for at least 4 hours outside the heads, after it had successfully escaped the damages deployed against it by the depth charges. An indicator loop reading of 3:01 a.m. recorded its re-entry into the battleground of Sydney's beloved waterway, but here it would face a bombardment of attacks. It was spotted and fired upon between 3:50 a.m. and 5 o'clock, and then 3 auxiliary patrol boats. Confident that these patrol boats had located the sub's position, further depth charges were unloaded, and it was soon clear that 1 or 2 of these blasts had damaged M21, as the vessel then rose to the surface of the harbour before sinking again. Upon a further 17 depth charges being dropped, it was believed by visual sightings of oil and bubbles rising to the surface that these attacks had finally been successful in destroying this third sub. But it would later be revealed that whilst minor damage had been incurred by these depth charges, ultimately it was the 2-man crew inside the midget submarine that self-destructed their vessel, blasting off its rear end and killing themselves in the process, just as dawn broke on the 1st of June 1942. As the city of Sydney awoke after a night of drama and destruction that had largely gone unnoticed for those not on the water, civilian shipping was brought to a standstill and naval vessels continued to patrol every branch of the waterway. After all, midget submarine M24 was still missing in action and had seemingly disappeared. Total censorship of the events was ordered, and the official statement on the afternoon of June the 1st simply reported that the Allies had destroyed 3 midget submarines in Sydney Harbour and skimmed briefly over the lives lost and the loss of 1 small harbour vessel of no military value. This censorship had been ordered to avoid a mass panic, but within the next few days several newspapers would illustrate the true nature of the attack to a bewildered public that had suddenly been caught so off guard. Only 2 days later, on the 3rd of June, the recovered bodies of the sailors on board the HMAS Catable, which lay in a sunken state off the shore of Garden Island, were honoured and given a military funeral. This was attended by Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould and over 200 Navy personnel. And in continuing to commemorate these lives lost, on the 1st of January 1943, the naval base at Garden Island was recommissioned as the HMAS Cuttable, a name which still stands today. Also, over the first days of June, the 2 partially destroyed midget submarines, that is M14 and M21, were recovered from their shadowy graves underneath Sydney Harbour, giving Sydney-siders a first-hand glimpse of the vessels that had finally managed to penetrate its defences. And while the Navy continued to try and censor the full details of the attack, resulting in one newspaper actually being charged for releasing defence information, the photos printed of retrieved subs from below the harbour were hard for the nation to ignore once printed across the papers. In a controversial move, the 4 Japanese crew members that were retrieved from the 2 damaged subs were given a cremation and funeral with full naval honours and a Japanese flag draped over each coffin. Whilst Muirhead Gould was criticised for this action, it was hoped by the Australian government that the Japanese would recognise the honour and dignity bestowed on its lost comrades, in the hope that it may improve the conditions of Australian prisoners of war that were experiencing all sorts of horrors in Japanese internment camps across the Pacific. Unfortunately, although authorities from Japan did note the funeral service, this did not seem to improve any major conditions for the Australian POWs. But amidst this activity, post the attack itself, the 5 mothership Japanese submarines were still waiting off the coast at large. According to their pre-arranged plan for a rendezvous with the midget submarines, this fleet had remained off the waters of Port Hacking over June 1st and 2nd, waiting for the midget submarines to return. A second rendezvous point to the north of Sydney was also explored by one of the submarines, but with no sign of the midgets they deployed returning to base, the commander of this fleet, Admiral Sasaki, ordered that they be dispersed and continued to carry out attack operations on the east coast of Australia on their own. This meant that it wasn't over for Sydney just yet, and on the morning of the 8th of June, a full week after the attack inside the harbour, one of the mothership submarines submerged itself just off the south head of Sydney Harbour. From this point, the submarine's commander ordered the gun crew to target Sydney Harbour Bridge. 10 shells would be fired over a 4-minute period, 9 of which would land in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Luckily, only minor damage was caused by 4 shells that managed to hit residential structures in suburbs such as Bondi, Bellevue Hill, Wallara and Rose Bay. Then, continuing their bombardment, the coastal city of Newcastle, north of Sydney, would face its own attack by the mothership submarines, which fired shells towards the shore and received return fire by coastal defences. At this point, just as swiftly and stealthily as the submarines had arrived on the east coast of Australia, the motherships of the Japanese fleet dispersed back into the deep, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean to continue other assaults and operations as the battle for the Pacific, which continued to be largely fought by American and Australian allies against the Japanese for the remainder of the war, was played out all around the northern parts of Australia's mainland. But while the attack that the Japanese had committed upon Sydney was, in the grand scheme of things, just really a minor operation in a much larger theatre of war, the damage that it had incurred on the psyche of Sydney was in fact far, far greater than the death and destruction it had left behind in the harbour itself. And whilst there was initial censorship of the attack, once the true details emerged and the people of Sydney realised that they were no longer just a passive spectator in a world of wars which had once seemed so far away, and that despite Sydney's long history of preparation for such an attack, it had left such obvious gaps and weaknesses that it was easy enough for Japanese planes to simply fly over the city, not just once but twice, find and report these flaws, with the result that the Japanese could then attempt, and in many ways were more successful than their earlier attack, using the same type of vessels at Pearl Harbor. And while yes, of course, in many ways there is just no comparison compared to the magnitude, death and destruction, as well as aftermath caused by the attack on Pearl Harbor, the fact that Sydney's defences had been breached and that so much more carnage could have been caused, alongside the fact that our static defence systems were either inactive or incomplete, and that even during the drama of the attack itself, the commander in charge of Sydney's harbour defence systems, as well as the captain of the main target that the Japanese were aiming for, the USS Chicago, were both reported to be drunk, indifferent, and dismissive of the serious reports that they'd received, and, as was blatantly clear, very slow to act, all amalgamated into a general fear across Sydney that it could or would become an easy and open target that could now fall prey at any given moment to a larger and more sophisticated Japanese attack that had now learnt exactly how and where to hit hardest. But what was all the result of this, you may ask, Tony? Well, of course, I could tell you that Sydney quickly fixed the gaps in its boom net. It made sure that its anti-submarine indicator loops were actually active and therefore useful, as well as being reported. It built a whole bunch more defensive bunkers, most of them small hidden gun batteries which littered the harbour and the headland, as well as anti-aircraft gun batteries, the most famous of these being built out of concrete on the very top of the stone pillars of Sydney Harbour Bridge. And in fact there they still sit, one of which serves as a lookout tower, which is actually a great alternative to the famous Tony. These and many more measures were of course obvious military responses, and so were the rows of razor wire that was set up on Sydney beaches in case a sudden Japanese attack landed on our shores. But the reality is that the real consequential result from this attack was a mass exodus of those who owned property or lived around the harbour and the coastal front. And so paranoid were they, and when I say they, I mean tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, that Sydney would be attacked in these places yet again, that an enormous sell-off of residentials, as well as a mass relocation of those who lived around these areas, would immediately take place and continue until the end of the war. In an almost comical move, one of the prime destinations for the relocations of those who had previously lived on the harbour was about 60 miles away inland in the Blue Mountains, with the idea of the era being that it was about as far and as high as you could go from the harbour and the coastline, but still remain within the greater Sydney region, and that it was very unlikely, let's just say impossible, for a midget submarine attack to make its way up the mountains whilst you were hiding in the hills. Funnily enough, after World War II ended, an enormous immigration process began, which welcomed so many new families from war-torn Europe to find a new home in Australia, and lo and behold, some of the cheapest possible properties available to them to start their new lives, with the many wonderful residences around Sydney Harbour and at beaches like Bondi, that now, any Sydney-sider will tell you, are the most expensive and prized pieces of real estate in all of the country. Aside from all this, and many other psychological interpretations that the people of Sydney at the time felt about the vulnerability of their harbour city, the Australian Defence Force decided that the best use of the two partially destroyed midget submarines, that is M14 and M21, which, after their self-destruction, were recovered from the depths of the harbour, was to fuse them together to create a version of one complete midget submarine, and then parade and exhibit this infamous piece of enemy warfare and weaponry throughout the many towns of Australia to use as a tangible piece of war propaganda to encourage ever more soldiers to enlist, particularly in the Navy. And to this end, the rebuilt submarine, mounted on a trailer, was taken around a country in a tour that covered around 2,500 miles. These days, the composite midget submarine vessel is housed at the Australian War Memorial. Whilst it was originally exhibited outside the museum's memorial, long after World War II, it suffered multiple vandalism attacks. The most iconic of these took place in 1966 when a bunch of university students spray-painted the midget submarine yellow. This, of course, being a time of Beatlemania, and with the Beatles themselves actually visiting Sydney in 1964, Australia's own yellow submarine had many people in hysterics at the time, none of which belonged to the senior command of the Australian Defence Force. But to finish up, Tony, and get back to the main topic of this presentation, Sydney Harbour, despite the heightened paranoia after the attempted midget submarine attack in 1942, and bearing in mind the long lead up to this in terms of Sydney Harbour defences and preparations against such an attack, by the end of World War II, with the dropping of the nuclear bombs in Japan, and with the great shifts of migration into Sydney, as well as so many other social changes in the 50s and 60s, it would seem to me that by the early years of the 21st century, this momentous event, the attack on Sydney in 1942, whilst of course being somewhat a minor event in the saga of war of World War II in general, had practically been forgotten, or at least just left out of the general conversation about Sydney's history. That is, until the year 2006, and by way of a conclusion to this presentation, you may remember that there were 3 midget submarines that attacked Sydney Harbour, one that got its propellers caught in the boom net, that is M14, the other after an aquatic game of cat and mouse, the other, known as M21, which came to its end through a mixture of self-destruction and depth charges. But what of M24? This being the midget submarine, that was the second sub to enter Sydney Harbour and had performed the bold move of tailgating a Sydney ferry through the boom net, only to dodge the patrol boats that started to hunt it before finding itself a hiding place in what's thought to be the deepest possible crevice of the harbour basin, which, going all the way back to our discussion on Sydney Harbour's geography, was actually a deep crevice in the bedrock of Sydney Harbour Basin that was once, thousands of years ago, a trench in the valley of the ancient river system that once flowed through Sydney, and then, after lying in wait, had found itself a position within shooting range of the main target, the USS Chicago, unloaded both of its torpedoes, before diving again, dodging all the patrol boats, and making its way back out of the harbour through the Sydney Heads into the Pacific Ocean, where it was clocked as passing the last of Sydney's anti-submarine indicator loops and into the deep blue at 1:58 a.m. The mystery as to what happened to it after this point, was a discussion that became a memory that became a myth. Long after the war had ended, military historians were still convinced that the submarine had tried to venture south following the Sydney coastline to attempt to be received by its mothership sub at their rendezvous point off the coast of Port Hacking. But as far as post-war military intelligence were aware, this rendezvous on the south coast of Sydney had never occurred. So where the hell was the missing sub? This great Sydney mystery was finally solved in November 2006, when a group of 7 amateur scuba divers who were diving off a place called Bungan Head, which is on Sydney's northern beaches, so that's the northern coast away from Sydney Harbour, a distance of approximately 10 miles from the entrance of the harbour, and about 3 miles off the coastline into the Pacific, spotted something very strange and out of place, sitting on the seabed approximately 180 feet below water. It was a tall, tube-like metal object sitting upright on the floor of the ocean. Soon enough, the commanding officer, now responsible for the Royal Australian Navy's Heritage Collection, inspected the site and confirmed that this was indeed the missing wreck of midget submarine M24. It had been sitting there silently in its watery grave for 64 years. The wreck of the sub had several bullet holes in it, which were most likely caused from the USS Chicago's quadruple machine gun mount, remembering that this had fired against it on that dramatic night within the harbour. This discovery caused much excitement in Sydney at the time and a renewed curiosity about Australia's participation in World War II by a whole new generation of Sydneysiders. However, the location of the wreck itself was kept secret by both the divers and the Navy, with the Defence Minister at the time promising to have it protected as an official war grave. And in a proud moment of solidarity between the two now friendly and allied nations of Australia and Japan, a Japanese admiral as well as an Australian vice-admiral presided over a ceremony at sea which was actually attended by Japanese relatives of this very midget submarine's 2-man crew all those years ago. For it was found that inside the midget submarine the remains of these 2 men were still trapped in their vessel below the waves. The ceremony was completed when relatives poured Japanese sake into the sea before being presented with sand taken from the seabed around this submarine. An analysis of what may have taken place on board that night in 1942 revealed that it was most likely that the Japanese crewmen inside midget submarine M24, after deploying both of their torpedoes in Sydney Harbour, one of which had sunken HMAS Cuttable, killing 21 sailors sleeping on board that night, had then managed to sneak their way undetected from Sydney Harbour and back out into the Pacific Ocean, where, instead of making their way south towards the mothership fleet, which had prearranged the primary rendezvous to be off the coast of Port Hacking, south of Sydney, this midget submarine, perhaps fearing that it was being hunted by Australia's patrol boats and not wanting to lead Sydney's naval defence forces directly to the position of the mothership submarines, had attempted to travel north from Sydney Harbour, where it is supposed that a secondary rendezvous point around the waters of Broken Bay, even further north, had been the final contingency plan. But after their active night trying to attack Sydney Harbour and the cat and mouse game that had been played between this submarine and Australia's defence forces, as well as the damage received by the gunshots from USS Chicago, the mechanics within their submarine, especially the battery, had suddenly given up, trapping the 2 men deep underwater, resting on the seabed inside a vessel with very limited oxygen supply until they expired. Whether or not these men felt their mission had been a success and their final thoughts below the water, we shall never know. Tony, this now brings us all the way up to the 21st century. As you know, a complicated time in the world of warfare, with a lot of unknowns around the globe concerning the future of conflict and peace. But I do hope that the context given and the story told of Sydney's harbour defences and their evolution, especially by the time of World War II, when the one and only aggressive attack that Sydney has ever received thus far in its colonial history, took the harbour as its target and the city by surprise. And on that note, I'll sign off. Have a fantastic Christmas, Tony. It's been great to have the chance to organise this presentation for you. And a big thanks for Taylor for commissioning it. Wishing you all the best for 2025 from Sydney down under Australia. You've been listening to Max Burns-McRuvie, and I'm over and out.